Before dawn, before the headlines, before history carved their names into stone, there were young Americans who kissed their families goodbye believing they would return. Boys who carried photographs in their pockets and hope in their hearts, unaware that the oceans they crossed and the skies they filled would become their final horizons. And as the nation slept, these young lives moved quietly toward moments that would change America forever. Moments that promised glory but delivered silence. Moments where the future stopped breathing and never came home. Part 1 begins in the final years of the Great Depression, when America was still healing and the world beyond its shores was already burning, as young men from farms, factories, city blocks, and small towns listened to radios crackle with news from Europe and Asia, names like Poland, France, China, and Pearl Harbor slowly becoming more than distant places, becoming warnings. And when December 7th, 1941 arrived, it was not just a military base in Hawaii that was attacked, but the imagined safety of an entire generation. Because within days, recruitment offices filled with teenagers barely old enough to shave, many lying about their age, driven by duty, fear, and a sense that history was calling them by name. Men like Private First Class Frank Davis from Ohio, who enlisted in the Army at 19 and trained at Fort Benning, writing letters home about sore feet and new friends, never mentioning the quiet fear he felt at night. Or Seaman Second Class Robert Bobby Thompson from Iowa, who joined the Navy and learned the rhythm of the sea aboard a destroyer escort in the Atlantic, watching convoys move slowly through gray water while German U-boats hunted unseen below. Or Technical Sergeant Joseph Martinez of New Mexico, a second-generation American who became part of the Army Air Forces, flying bombers from dusty runways in England, believing that altitude and formation could protect him, believing that skill and teamwork could keep him alive. And as training camps expanded across the country, mothers folded uniforms, fathers offered handshakes instead of hugs, and communities held farewell dinners beneath flags that now felt heavier than cloth. And these young men boarded trains that pulled away while bands played and crowds waved, unaware that many of those smiles would never be answered again, because the war they were entering was larger and more unforgiving than anything America had known. And soon the Atlantic became a battlefield where supply lines meant survival, where icy waters swallowed ships like the USS Reuben James, and later the USS Dorchester, carrying soldiers and sailors into darkness. And though historians would later count the losses in numbers, each sinking meant young lives ending far from home, names that would arrive in small printed notices weeks later. While in Europe, American soldiers landed in North Africa in Operation Torch in November 1942, stepping onto unfamiliar shores under fire, discovering quickly that war was not the clean movement of maps, but confusion, heat, dust, and fear. And among them were infantrymen like Private John Miller from Pennsylvania, who survived his first landing but was later lost during fighting near Kasserine Pass, where American forces learned hard lessons against experienced German troops. And though official reports spoke of tactical withdrawals and reorganizations, families would receive telegrams stating only that their sons were missing in action, a phrase that carried hope and dread in equal measure, because missing meant not knowing, and not knowing meant waiting. And as the war expanded, the skies over Europe filled with American bombers flying daylight missions deep into enemy territory, believing precision bombing could shorten the war. And young airmen climbed aboard B-17s and B-24s knowing that the odds were against them, because missions over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin were met by intense defenses, and entire crews disappeared when planes failed to return, including men like Lieutenant Harold Brooks from California, whose bomber was last seen damaged over Germany in 1943. His crew later declared lost, with no graves, only names engraved years later on the walls of the missing at American cemeteries overseas. While in the Pacific, another kind of war unfolded, stretching across vast distances where islands became stepping stones and jungles hid dangers that maps could not show. And young Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, facing heat, disease, and constant tension. And among them was Private First Class William Bill Carter from Texas, who wrote home about mosquitoes and the strange quiet before nightfall. before he was killed during a patrol months later. His remains never recovered because in the Pacific, the land itself often swallowed the fallen. And as battles like Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu followed, casualty lists grew. And despite strict censorship, the reality of loss crept into American homes through folded flags and solemn visits, while the nation pushed forward believing sacrifice was the price of victory. And in 1944, as preparations began for the largest amphibious invasion in history, young soldiers crowded camps in southern England, training endlessly for a mission whose details were hidden but whose danger was understood. Men like Corporal James Reynolds from Massachusetts, part of the 29th Infantry Division, who trained for months along the English coast, writing letters filled with restraint and coded phrases, knowing his family would sense the truth between the lines. And on June 6, 1944, before sunrise, thousands of landing craft moved toward the beaches of Normandy, carrying Americans who had never seen combat and veterans who knew too well what awaited them. And though history would later call it D-Day and mark it as a turning point, for those young men, it was simply the moment where training ended and fate took over. And while some would survive to tell the story, others would vanish into the chaos of smoke, water, and confusion, their last moments witnessed only by those beside them. And as the beachhead was secured and Europe slowly liberated, the war continued to claim lives in forests, towns, and skies, from the hedgerows of France to the frozen Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, where young American soldiers endured bitter cold and relentless pressure, and young men like Private First Class Edward Nolan from New York froze in foxholes, holding ground against overwhelming odds, some never leaving those positions alive. And yet, even as the war in Europe approached, the Pacific War intensified, with battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa revealing how costly the final stages would be, and Marines raised flags that became symbols, while thousands of families received the news they feared most. And as August 1945 approached and the atomic bomb brought sudden surrender from Japan, celebrations filled American streets. But for many homes, the war did not end with parades, because their sons were already gone, buried in foreign soil or lost at sea, never to return. And years later, mothers would travel to cemeteries in Normandy, Italy, and the Pacific, touching names carved in marble, while others would stand before walls of missing names, knowing there would be no grave to visit, only memory. And as America moved into a new era, building highways, suburbs, and dreams, the absence of these young soldiers lingered quietly, shaping families that never formed and futures that never arrived. And the nation honored them with memorials and ceremonies. Yet behind every name was a life interrupted, a story unfinished. And as the world remembers the victories of World War II, it must also pause at the moment where these young Americans stepped forward and never came home, because their silence is part of the history. And just as the guns fell quiet and the world began to rebuild, unanswered questions remained about final moments, lost letters, and last thoughts, questions that would haunt families for decades. And as investigators searched battlefields and oceans for answers, one discovery in particular would reopen old wounds and bring the past crashing into the present, stopping this story at the exact moment when the truth was about to surface and change everything they thought they knew. The discovery began quietly, not with headlines or ceremonies, but with careful work by historians, recovery teams, and military investigators who returned to old battlefields decades after the war had ended, guided by records, witness accounts, and fragments left behind. And for families who had lived with uncertainty since the 1940s, these efforts carried both hope and fear, because answers, once found, could never be undone. And in Europe, teams working with the American Battle Monuments Commission and the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency revisited crash sites of lost aircraft, places where local villagers had long remembered the sound of engines failing and planes disappearing into fields or forests. And at one such site in Germany, investigators uncovered wreckage believed to belong to a B-17 bomber lost in 1943. Matching serial numbers to records that listed Lieutenant Harold Brooks and his crew as missing for nearly 80 years. And while the discovery did not change the outcome, it changed the story. Because for the first time, families had confirmation, a location, and an understanding that their sons had not simply vanished, but had fallen in service. And similar efforts took place in the Pacific, where jungles were cleared and reefs examined, as researchers searched for Marines and sailors lost during island battles and naval engagements. And in places like the waters near Guadalcanal and the Philippine Sea, sonar and underwater vehicles located shipwrecks resting silently on the ocean floor, steel hulls preserved by death and time. And among them were destroyers, submarines, and transport ships that had gone down with young Americans aboard, their final resting places untouched since the war. And when these discoveries were announced, they did not bring celebration, but reflection, because each wreck represented hundreds of unfinished lives. And back home, families who had received telegrams marked missing or killed in action revisited old letters, photographs, and medals, now seen through the lens of confirmation rather than uncertainty. And some families chose to travel overseas, standing where their sons had last been seen, while others preferred to remember them as they were before the war, frozen in time at 19 or 20, forever young. And as historians pieced together these individual stories, a larger truth became clear, that the generation who fought World War II paid its price not only on the battlefield, but across decades of absence, shaping post-war America in ways both visible and unseen. Because for every soldier who never came home, there were parents who aged with unanswered questions, siblings who grew up differently, and communities that carried quiet gaps where lives should have been. And yet, despite the loss, these young Americans helped define the world that followed, because their service contributed to the defeat of totalitarian regimes, the rebuilding of Europe through the Marshall Plan, and the emergence of the United States as a global leader. And while history books often focus on generals, strategies, and outcomes, the true cost of the war is found in personal stories, like that of Corporal James Reynolds, whose body was identified decades later in Normandy, allowing his remains to be returned home for burial at last. Or Private John Miller, whose name remains engraved among the missing, a reminder that not all stories receive closure. And as time moved on, memorials multiplied, from small-town plaques to the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., where visitors read names and dates, often realizing for the first time how young these soldiers were. And during commemorations, aging veterans stood beside children and grandchildren, telling stories not of glory, but of friends who never made it back, emphasizing that remembrance was not about celebrating war, but honoring sacrifice. And in classrooms and documentaries, the narrative slowly shifted to include not just victories, but the human cost paid by those who did not live to see peace. And even today, the work continues as recovery teams search remote locations, guided by advances in technology and renewed commitment, because the promise made to those families long ago has not expired, and every identification, no matter how late, is treated as a solemn duty fulfilled. And through these efforts, the stories of young American soldiers who never came home are no longer lost to silence, but preserved with care, ensuring that future generations understand that freedom was not inevitable, but earned by ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. And as the last eyewitnesses fade and history becomes memory, these names remain, carved in stone, written in archives, and spoken aloud during moments of remembrance, reminding the nation that behind every chapter of World War II are young lives that ended too soon, lives that left home with hope and returned only as legacy. And in recognizing them, America continues a conversation with its past, one that refuses to forget those who gave everything, and asks each generation to remember why their absence still matters.